Well, Martin, clearly the fact that Africa's population is forecast to double from about 1 billion people to 2 billion people over the next 25 to 30 years clearly has a lot of people worried. For a long time, of course, malnutrition rates in Africa have been very high. It's a continent very often associated with famine and chronic food deprivation. So clearly, the fact that you have such demographic growth is further catapulting Africa on international agendas, particularly as they pertain to food security, but development issues more broadly. Now, I think that this kind of extra attention, this extra focus is welcome in a sense, but provided there's the right kind of attention. If the lens is just a simplistic Malthusian lens, in which we need to stave off some kind of cataclysmic future, either by imposing birth control or interfering in African cultures and habits, I think it's not only unlikely to be very successful, it's also likely to be perceived as extremely intrusive. What I think is the more interesting question is, can we learn a lesson from the last 40 years, 50 years of agricultural development strategies that haven't worked there, and can we switch focus in the policy instruments, in the way we think about agricultural development on the continent? And I think that that's really where the interesting debates academically, but also in policy terms, are happening. And what I've tried to highlight in my work is the increasing importance of trying to trust African farmers more, and to trying to empower African farmers to take the lead in increasing agricultural productivity, working themselves out of poverty, and finding opportunities to change the terms of trade they have with other parts of the world. And that take a long and complex process, but fundamentally needs to be a model of development, model of agricultural development in which farmers are central. Africa is still is still the most rural continent on Earth. It's still the only continent with a very clear majority of people who are rural dwellers rather than urban dwellers. It means the stakes of this are very, very high. As I said, against the background, of course, of climate change, of rising populations. But there is no intrinsic reason, I think, why Africa and African population should be unable to meet this challenge. I'm not at all a pessimist, as many people are. But that, of course, will require a change in the way we think about development and about food security on the continent. Well, for about 40 or 50 years, I think people in West Asia, in the Arab world in particular, have of course come to the conclusion that as consumption rates have gone up here of food and of water and also of energy, of course, that it makes a lot of sense to collaborate with states, with societies on the other side of the Red Sea in particular. There's a lot of cultural proximity, social connections, a long history of migration, of course, similar religions. What I think is important is to build on that common social and cultural foundation, and to provide the kind of investment and the kind of trade patterns that would actually contribute both to meeting the very real demands over here, in terms of the kind of imports of produce and imports of commodities, but also in ways that help empower, as I said, farmers on the ground there, and that help contribute to poverty reduction. One of the main focuses in my work is to warn against the kind of easy, or seemingly easy, top-down, capital-intensive agricultural modernization strategies, which often involve the cultivation of monocultures, and which take a very simplistic approach, both to ecological, economic, and developmental challenges, and to try to find an approach indeed which may be harder in the short term, in the sense that you're forced to engage a much larger number of farmers, of producers, of people in these societies, but which will build a far more sustainable, and I mean by that both environmentally sustainable, but also politically sustainable model, in which there is genuine win-win, in which genuinely indeed the export of food grown, for example, in the Horn of Africa to the Arab world leads indeed, as I said, to the meeting of demands for food and water in this part of the world, but also does so in a way that actually boosts the disposable incomes of ordinary African farmers, and doesn't just benefit a small capitalist at the top and their political protectors or allies, which historically, unfortunately, has been the interaction. Historically, most investors from this part of the world, most trade partners, have done so in a way that alienates people, that disenfranchises them, pushes them off their land, that on the long term actually leads to declining production and productivity both, rather than to an increase in it. And so I think that both regions, also for geopolitical reasons, have a stake in each other's well-being and welfare. There's a lot of concerns about this at the moment. I think that agriculture could well be one of the ways in which we reverse this pattern of worrying about each other and of distrust, and build something that actually helps people on both sides of the Red Sea. Well, I think very important, because sometimes there's a bit of a misconception that because of this cultural and social proximity, people think they know each other very well and understand each other very well, whilst in actual fact they often do not. There's often very deep misunderstandings in many, for example, Horn of Africa societies about how exactly decision-making in the Gulf or in the Levant happens, and very similarly, people here often think they know places like Sudan or Ethiopia and Somalia, except that actually one is sometimes shocked by the ignorance at the very local level in terms of who to talk to, who not to talk to, issues around land, for example, that are very sensitive. People think, well, I've offered you payment for this land, therefore it's mine and I can use it in whatever way I see fit. That may not quite be the way it plays out at the local level. And that's, of course, where education comes in, real-world education. A real understanding, a real joint partnership that is based, of course, in mutual respect and that looks at ways, as I said, that meets both the needs of those who provide the capital, who put in the investment and make a number of things happen, as well as those who will do the actual work, the actual cultivation, for example, of crops whose interest, whose worldview, whose experiences, even if they may seem a bit strange or irrational or bizarre, are actually of fundamental importance if this is to be sustainable and long-term. I think absolutely, Martin. I mean, I think we're really dealing with a very tragic situation, both in this part of the world as well as in East Africa, where for many decades, many generations, people have fought each other over resources and have these resources have divided societies, divided peoples, pushed regions apart. Whilst in many ways, if we could change some of the thinking, some of the political structures around that, some of the identity questions around that, they could actually serve to provide the underpinnings of, as I said, of great shared prosperity. And giving up very narrow-minded notions of food security or energy security or water security, which really only benefit, as I said, a small number of people, at the expense of a large number of people who, even though policies are officially in the name of national food security, energy security, actually disempower rather than empower and exclude rather than include. I think that's the way to go, and I think the Nile Basin is a classic example of this. There's plenty of water in many ways to go around. The question is, of course, how do you allocate that water? How do you distribute? What use do you make of this water? And very similarly on food and, of course, on the energy that can be produced with that water. These societies have so much to gain from coming together. What I think is the really big challenge is how we can craft and package regional integration proposals and strategies in ways that convince power holders who have benefited so much from exclusionary models to broaden the number of beneficiaries, both within regions and within society as well as across it. And it's something I think that certainly applies, of course, to the Middle East as well. It's outrageous that you still have the number of people that you have who are unemployed, who are excluded, who are struggling to make ends meet, who do not find themselves with reliable access to public services, whose incomes are uncertain. There is no intrinsic reason why societies here or in East Africa should be poor. They are poor in many reasons because of man-made factors, and because they're made by man, they can also be changed by man. And that's, I think, where again the organizational, the political bases and details matter so much, rather than being obsessed with sheer resource availability, which for too long, as I said, has boxed in our thinking and has often led to extraordinarily misguided, sometimes outright malicious policies, rather than policies that actually, as I said, help the ordinary people of these regions. Well, potentially this could be very beneficial. I mean, for example, the fact that China is increasingly interested in developing African ports is utterly crucial. If Africa is indeed, as I said, to provide this part of the world with much greater access to a whole range of commodities, then things like warehousing, like roads, like railways, like seaports, like airports are utterly essential. Now, for many decades, Western donors have neglected infrastructure and told themselves that all the money should either go into anti-corruption or healthcare and education. Of course, these things are very important. But the fact that they came at the expense of infrastructure when you've already had such a poor infrastructure basis in Africa, and where so much of that original infrastructure was built in function of colonial needs rather than the needs of ordinary Africans, means I think that from the perspective of most people, certainly in East Africa, China's arrival and China's increased role is very, very welcome. Now, of course, as always with foreign suitor, the devil is in the details. How can you make these projects, these big infrastructural projects, work for people. And here's, of course, where African governments, African civil society have an increasingly important role in leveraging this opportunity and pushing back and ensuring, for example, that in these projects, yes, X number of Africans are involved, that the focus on development of the local market and the supplying of local needs is something that is taken into account. This is not just at a global and macro level, but that there's real, tangible local gains, which are both good in and of themselves, but also contribute to the political legitimacy and the social legitimacy of what China and other actors are doing. So in that sense, China is indeed not a trend that will go away. It is a structural feature of Africa's and the Middle East international relations that's here to stay. The question is, how do you turn it into something, as I said, that contributes to sustainability and stability rather than the reverse? But here too, as I said, I'm an optimist. I believe it can be made to work. There's, from China's perspective, much to be gained from a constructive, mutually beneficial relationship with these different regions. And I think that on the whole, China's presence has been good news for Africa and for this wider region. It has elevated its importance in global agendas. It has given Africans a feeling of being taken seriously, not just objects of pity, but economic agents and sources of opportunity in their own right. And so now it's a question of, as I said, of taking the next step and making sure that investment and attention then is used for durable progress in developmental terms. I think it's essential. I think there's no other way. Again, this is an increasingly durable intrinsic feature of the international relations of our world and certainly of these regions. I think there's much to gain. I mean, think, for example, again of the issues of ports. You wouldn't want all major ports in the Arab world controlled, for example, by DP World, by one provider. The fact that China itself is developing a series of ports, Duqm in Oman, for example, is a welcome thing. It creates competition. It ensures that the kind of services and facilities provided are not just monopolized and therefore with risk of much lower quality and political instrumentalization. It gives governments, particularly weak states, a choice. And from the perspective of weak and poor and fragile states, having a choice is an incredible improvement over a situation where all too often they are on the receiving end of external decisions and external forces. Here they can hopefully try to maximize some benefits and put some things on the table that are important to them and to their people. So in that sense, yes, a world that's entirely dominated by the United States or by the West historically has not been the most conducive context for economic, for social, for political development for this region or for East Africa. In that sense, that I think that a bipolar or multipolar world may well offer greater opportunities for them to take control of their own destiny and make their own choices. Well, I think it's good that you mentioned both students from East Africa and from here, because as I said, I think this interaction between the Middle East and Africa, which is at the core of my own work, but is already important, but is only going to become more important for the demographic reasons you outlined, for ecological reasons, because increasingly there's a security and a political interdependence. This is the field to work in, I think, both academically, but also in terms of policy. The people who understand these trends best, who speak different languages, who are conversant with multiple cultural symbols, who understand these societies, have huge advantages and are able to shape those connections. These connections are ultimately what we make them. They can be very positive, they can be very benign, they can be, as I said, they can really work towards including greater number of peoples in economically uplifting them, or they could be those ties of distrust, of export of refugees, of conflict, of sectarian hatreds. That choice is up to us to make, and young people, students in particular, have an opportunity by learning more, by understanding, by traveling, to give meaning, positive meaning to those ties that are forming and becoming denser. And I think that's an exciting thing to be part of, and I hope that the more young people who make that choice, the better for the regions where they come from and the regions where increasingly they will go to work, to learn, to understand, to interact.